Control is a quiet force that often enters our lives through the smallest gestures. An innocent suggestion, a subtle comment, or a simple act of concern. At first, it doesn't wear the face of danger. It can look like love, protection, or even care. Someone checks where you are, not because they're suspicious, but because they worry. They correct your choices, not because they want power, but because they know better. These acts can seem harmless, even comforting. But beneath this surface lies the seed of obsession, the dangerous belief that one person has the right to shape, limit, or dominate another person's life. Control begins with intention, and often that intention is not initially evil. Many who seek to control others start from fear. Fear of losing love, fear of being rejected, fear of uncertainty. But fear, when left unchecked, transforms into obsession. It creates a hunger to hold on tighter, to know everything, to dictate every move. What starts as a desire to keep things safe turns into a need to possess, to mold, and to dominate. The controller becomes addicted to certainty, and the victim becomes the price of that addiction. This pattern of control rarely begins with violence or open aggression. It begins with emotional conditioning. Imagine a relationship, romantic, familial, or even professional, where one person slowly learns to seek approval from the other. The controller sets invisible boundaries: what's acceptable to say, how to behave, even what emotions can be expressed. When the victim complies, they are rewarded with affection, praise, or attention. When they resist, they face silence, criticism, or guilt. Over time, the victim's world shrinks. They start making choices not from freedom, but from fear of disappointing or angering the other. This is how control becomes invisible, because it hides behind the illusion of love and concern. In the psychology of control, there's a concept called covert domination. It's the art of controlling without appearing controlling. The manipulator doesn't need to raise their voice. They only need to raise doubt in the victim's mind. I'm just trying to help you. I'm only saying this because I care. No one else understands you like I do. These statements sound kind, but their true purpose is to isolate, to confuse, and to make the victim dependent. Once the victim begins to doubt their own judgment, the controller's power becomes complete. Control is never about chains. It's about choices, about shaping another person's perception until they believe those chains are their own idea. What makes this game dangerous is its subtlety. Society often overlooks emotional and psychological control because it lacks visible scars. Yet it is one of the most destructive forms of abuse. A person under control doesn't lose freedom all at once. They surrender it piece by piece. First, they stop arguing to keep the peace. Then, they stop expressing opinions to avoid conflict. Then, they stop making decisions altogether because it causes problems. In time, they lose their sense of identity. They no longer ask, "What do I want?" but instead, what will keep them happy? This silent erosion of self is what makes control so powerful. It rewrites who a person is from the inside out. Control also thrives on imbalance. The controller positions themselves as superior, more logical, more capable, more emotionally stable. They convince the other that they are too emotional, too naive, or too dependent to manage on their own. This dynamic is not always obvious, especially to outsiders. The controller can be charming, intelligent, and even admired by others. They might appear as the perfect partner or supportive friend, but behind closed doors, their need for dominance turns love into leverage. The victim begins to believe that they can't live without the controller's guidance or approval. What began as affection becomes captivity. From an educational perspective, understanding how control manifests is essential for prevention. Emotional control often begins with surveillance disguised as care, constant checking of messages, questioning of friends, or monitoring whereabouts. Then comes emotional manipulation, guilt-tripping, gaslighting, or using affection as a weapon. Gradually, the victim's autonomy disappears. They stop making independent choices, not because they are incapable, but because they've been trained to doubt themselves. This process is not limited to romantic relationships. It happens in families, workplaces, and even friendships. Wherever power is unbalanced and emotional dependence is fostered, control finds a home. The most tragic part is that the controller often believes they are acting out of love. Obsession convinces them that control equals care, that by directing someone's life, they are protecting them. But true love respects freedom. It celebrates individuality. Obsession, on the other hand, destroys both. It traps the victim in fear and the controller in illusion. The controller becomes consumed by the need to maintain dominance, while the victim becomes trapped in the need to survive it. Both lose their humanity in the process. Education about control must therefore start with awareness, recognizing the difference between care and coercion. Healthy relationships are built on trust, not monitoring, on communication, not intimidation. A person who truly loves you will never make you feel smaller, weaker, or incapable. They will empower you to make your own choices, even if those choices lead you away from them. Control, however, breeds dependency. It seeks to own, not to love. It is a game where only one person wins and both eventually lose. From a broader social lens, our culture often romanticizes control. We see it in movies where jealousy is mistaken for passion, where dominance is portrayed as strength, and where persistence in love is glorified even when boundaries are crossed. These narratives normalize unhealthy power dynamics. They teach young people that control is proof of care, when in truth it is proof of fear. To unlearn this, education must focus on emotional literacy, teaching individuals to recognize manipulation, to value autonomy, and to understand that saying no is not a betrayal, but a boundary. Control is not always loud, but it is always dangerous. It erodes confidence, silences individuality, and replaces freedom with fear. It takes what is human, our ability to choose, and transforms it into obedience. The first step toward ending the dangerous game of control is to recognize it for what it is, a distortion of love, a misuse of power, and a denial of equality. Only when we understand its quiet beginnings can we prevent its devastating end. For the most powerful form of resistance is awareness. And awareness, once awakened, cannot be controlled. Manipulation is one of the most insidious forms of control because it operates quietly through words, emotions, and psychological pressure rather than visible force. It is a mental chess game where one person tries to control the thoughts and actions of another, often making the victim believe that they are acting out of their own free will. The manipulator's goal is simple: power without accountability. They want obedience without appearing oppressive and submission without visible conflict. At its core, psychological manipulation begins with understanding human vulnerability. Every person has emotional needs: love, approval, belonging, and validation. Manipulators exploit these needs to create dependency. They learn what their target values most, be it affection, respect, or success, and then use it as leverage. For example, a manipulator might shower their partner with affection and praise early in a relationship to build emotional attachment. But once trust is established, they begin to withdraw that affection strategically, conditioning the victim to earn it back through compliance. This is known as intermittent reinforcement, a powerful psychological tactic often used in both abusive relationships and behavioral conditioning experiments. 1. Of the most effective tools in a manipulator's arsenal is gaslighting. This technique distorts reality, making the victim doubt their own memory, perception, and sanity. For instance, when confronted about a hurtful action, a manipulator might deny it ever happened, say the victim is too sensitive, or insist they misunderstood. Over time, this erodes the victim's confidence in their own judgment. They begin to rely on the manipulator's version of events because it feels safer than the confusion of constant self-doubt. The victim's sense of truth becomes dependent on the abuser, creating a psychological prison without walls. Another common tactic is guilt tripping. Manipulators use guilt to maintain control by framing themselves as victims. They may say things like, "After everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me," or, "If you really cared, you'd do this for me." These statements are designed to trigger empathy and responsibility, forcing the victim to comply out of a sense of moral obligation rather than genuine choice. This emotional blackmail keeps the manipulator in power while making the victim feel selfish for asserting their own needs. Isolation is also a critical tactic. By cutting off the victim's access to support systems, friends, family, colleagues, the manipulator removes alternative perspectives that might challenge their control. This doesn't always happen through direct commands. Sometimes it's done subtly. They may plant seeds of doubt, saying things like, "Your friends don't really care about you," or "Your family doesn't understand our relationship." The goal is to make the victim feel that the manipulator is the only person who truly understands or cares for them. Once isolated, the victim becomes easier to influence because they no longer have external sources of validation or truth. Manipulators also employ projection, a defense mechanism in which they accuse others of the very behavior they're guilty of. For example, a controlling partner might accuse their victim of being too controlling or untrustworthy. This tactic diverts attention from their own behavior and keeps the victim constantly apologizing and defending themselves. The manipulator maintains moral superiority by twisting reality so that the victim appears to be the problem. Then there's the use of fear and reward cycles. In these dynamics, the manipulator alternates between affection and intimidation. They may show kindness after a conflict to create relief and false hope, convincing the victim that things are better now. But as soon as the victim relaxes, the manipulator reasserts control through anger, threats, or emotional withdrawal. This unpredictable pattern keeps the victim on edge, constantly trying to avoid the next punishment or earn the next reward. The result is emotional dependency. The victim becomes addicted to the moments of peace and affection, believing they can restore the relationship if they just try harder. In educational terms, understanding manipulation requires awareness of how power dynamics function in relationships. Healthy relationships are based on equality, mutual respect, and open communication. Manipulative relationships, however, rely on imbalance. One person seeks to dominate, while the other is gradually conditioned to submit. The manipulator thrives on secrecy and confusion, while the victim loses clarity and confidence. It's also important to note that manipulation can occur in any context, not just romantic relationships. It can exist in workplaces, friendships, families, and even institutions. A boss might manipulate employees through fear of job loss, using praise and criticism to maintain control. A parent might emotionally manipulate a child to maintain dependency well into adulthood. In each case, the pattern is the same: control disguised as care, domination disguised as guidance. From a psychological standpoint, manipulators often possess traits associated with narcissism, sociopathy, or deep insecurity. They crave control because it compensates for their inner fear of powerlessness. Their need to dominate others is rooted in their inability to regulate their own emotions or tolerate uncertainty. This doesn't excuse their behavior, but it helps us understand why manipulation is so persistent. It fulfills a psychological need for superiority and validation. For those who find themselves being manipulated, awareness is the first line of defense. Recognizing the signs, constant guilt, walking on eggshells, feeling confused after conversations, or doubting your own reality, is crucial. Once identified, setting clear boundaries becomes essential. Boundaries communicate that manipulation will no longer be tolerated. This may provoke resistance from the manipulator, as control depends on compliance. However, consistency and support from others can weaken the manipulator's hold. Education plays a vital role in preventing manipulation from taking root. Schools and communities should teach emotional intelligence, assertiveness, and communication skills. Learning how to express needs, recognize red flags, and maintain personal boundaries is as important as academic education. People must be taught early that love is not control, and caring is not the same as compliance. In the end, psychological manipulation is not just a personal issue, it's a societal one. It thrives in cultures that reward dominance, silence vulnerability, and equate obedience with loyalty. To dismantle it, we must shift our understanding of strength. True strength is not in control. It is in compassion, honesty, and respect for others' autonomy. Manipulation may seem powerful, but it is built on fear. Awareness, courage, and education are the tools that expose its weakness and restore freedom to those who have been silenced by it. The journey of a victim in a manipulative or controlling relationship does not begin with weakness. It begins with trust, hope, and love, the very qualities that make a person human. Many victims enter such dynamics with pure intentions, believing in understanding, compromise, and emotional connection. What they do not realize at first is that these very strengths can be turned against them by someone who views vulnerability not as something to protect, but as something to exploit. The descent from peace to control is almost always gradual. In the beginning, the relationship may feel extraordinary, with intense affection, constant communication, and promises of devotion. This stage, known as love bombing, overwhelms the victim with validation and attention. The manipulator mirrors their interests, praises their qualities, and creates an illusion of perfect compatibility. To the victim, it feels like destiny. To the manipulator, it is a strategy. Once emotional dependence is formed, the dynamics begin to shift, subtly at first, then sharply. Soon, the same behaviors that once felt loving become suffocating. Questions like, "Where were you?" or "Who were you with?" start to sound less like concern and more like suspicion. Criticism creeps in, masked as helpful advice or constructive feedback. The victim begins to walk on eggshells, constantly adjusting their behavior to avoid conflict or disapproval. When they express discomfort, they are told they are overreacting or too sensitive. This is the moment the silence begins, the point where the victim starts to suppress their feelings, choosing peace over truth. In the early stages, victims often don't recognize what's happening. They internalize the blame, believing that if they just love harder, communicate better, or change themselves, things will improve. The manipulator reinforces this belief by alternating between cruelty and kindness. After a period of emotional distance or anger, they suddenly become affectionate again, apologizing or promising change. This intermittent cycle of punishment and reward creates confusion and hope, a psychological trap that keeps the victim invested. They hold on to the memory of the loving person they first met, convincing themselves that the good version of their partner still exists and will return if they just do the right thing. But as time passes, the victim's emotional world becomes smaller. They start to doubt their perceptions, their worth, and their instincts. Friends and family may notice changes, isolation, anxiety, defensiveness, but the victim often defends their abuser. They might say, "You don't know them like I do," or "They're just under stress." This is not denial born of ignorance. It is a form of psychological survival. Accepting that someone they love is deliberately harming them is too painful, too destabilizing. So they rationalize, minimize, and justify anything to preserve the illusion of safety. The silence grows heavier with time. Victims learn to anticipate moods, to read subtle cues in tone or expression. Their thoughts revolve around avoiding conflict or disappointment. They may lose touch with their own desires, opinions, and identity. The controller's voice becomes louder in their head than their own. It tells them what to wear, what to say, who to trust, and how to think. In some cases, this control extends even to self-perception. The victim begins to see themselves through the eyes of the manipulator, inadequate, ungrateful, or unlovable. Yet, beneath the surface, something resists, a small, flickering awareness that something isn't right. It may begin as a moment of doubt, a question that lingers longer than usual. Why am I always the one apologizing? Or why do I feel afraid to speak? This is the spark of awakening. It doesn't always lead to immediate change, but it marks the beginning of a shift from silence to awareness. Often, the journey to awareness is triggered by a breaking point, an incident so painful or humiliating that it pierces through the fog of manipulation. It could be a public humiliation, a threat, a lie exposed, or a realization that no amount of love can stop the harm. In that moment, the victim begins to see the pattern, the cycle of control, apology, and repetition. They begin to name it for what it is, abuse. That naming is powerful because once you can define your experience, you begin to reclaim ownership of it. However, awareness does not immediately equal escape. Leaving a manipulative relationship is one of the hardest psychological processes a person can endure. Victims often face fear, guilt, and confusion. They may fear retaliation, loneliness, or judgment. They may feel guilty for abandoning someone they once loved or for not leaving sooner. Manipulators exploit these emotions, using threats, tears, or promises to pull them back. The process of breaking free, therefore, is rarely linear. It is filled with progress and relapse, courage and doubt. Education and support are crucial at this stage. Victims need safe spaces, friends, counselors, or support groups that validate their experiences without judgment. Validation helps reverse the effects of gaslighting. When someone finally says what you went through was not your fault, it begins to rebuild the shattered sense of self. Awareness then grows into empowerment. The victim learns that control and love cannot coexist, that freedom and self-worth are not luxuries, but rights. The journey from silence to awareness also carries a social lesson. Too often, society blames victims, asking, "Why didn't they leave?" instead of, "Why did someone harm them?" This mindset keeps many trapped in shame. We must shift our perspective to compassion and education. People do not fall into manipulation because they are weak, but because they are human, capable of empathy, trust, and hope. The manipulator weaponizes these qualities, but they are also the very strengths that help survivors heal. Awareness transforms victims into survivors. It teaches them to recognize red flags, to rebuild boundaries, and to trust themselves again. It also allows them to speak, to share their stories, and break the silence that once bound them. Every survivor who speaks up dismantles the myth that control is invisible or acceptable. Their voice becomes a light for others still trapped in the dark. The journey is not easy, but it is possible. Silence may begin as a shield, but awareness becomes a sword, cutting through lies, reclaiming truth, and restoring dignity. In the end, awareness is not just about understanding what happened. It's about rediscovering who you are beyond the control, beyond the pain, and beyond the fear. It is the moment when a victim stops surviving for someone else and begins living for themselves again. And that moment, that shift from silence to awareness, is the true beginning of freedom. Obsession is not love, it is a distortion of it. Where love nurtures freedom, obsession suffocates it. It is a craving for possession, not connection. A hunger to dominate, not to understand. The tragic truth is that obsession destroys not only the victim, but also the one consumed by the need to control. It is a slow unraveling that leaves behind emotional scars, broken identities, and shattered lives. The dangerous game of control is not played without cost. It always exacts a price, from both sides. For the victim, the consequences are often invisible at first. Obsession begins with small invasions, someone wanting to know everything, to be everywhere, to have every answer. At first it feels flattering. Who wouldn't want to be loved so deeply, to be the center of someone's world? But soon that attention becomes suffocating. Every decision, every conversation, every move begins to be monitored, questioned, or criticized. The victim's personal boundaries slowly disappear, and with them, their sense of safety. Psychologically, the impact is profound. Victims of obsessive control often develop chronic anxiety, hypervigilance, and self-doubt. They learn to anticipate emotional outbursts and modify their behavior to prevent them, a process known as trauma adaptation. This constant state of alertness reshapes the brain's stress response, leaving the victim trapped in cycles of fear and exhaustion. Many begin to experience what psychologists call learned helplessness, a condition where a person feels incapable of escaping a harmful situation, even when opportunities for help exist. Emotionally, obsession isolates. The victim's social circle often shrinks because the controller views friends and family as threats to their influence. They may be discouraged or even forbidden from seeing others. Over time, the victim's world becomes smaller and smaller until it revolves entirely around the manipulator. This isolation deepens dependency and makes it increasingly difficult to leave. Eventually, the victim may lose not only their freedom but also their sense of identity. They forget who they were before the control began. The consequences are not limited to the emotional sphere. Long-term exposure to obsessive control can lead to physical effects as well. Sleep disturbances, headaches, fatigue, and even weakened immunity due to constant stress. Victims may also develop depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, or other mental health conditions. The wounds of obsession do not always bleed outward. They often bleed inward, quietly. shaping a life defined by fear and self-doubt long after the relationship ends. But what of the controller, the person consumed by obsession? Their consequences, though different, are equally destructive. The obsessive individual often begins with insecurity, a fear of loss, rejection, or insignificance. They try to ease this fear through control, believing that if they can dictate another person's actions, they can guarantee love or loyalty. But obsession never satisfies. It feeds on itself, creating a constant state of paranoia. The controller becomes trapped in their own creation, haunted by the very fears they sought to eliminate. This obsession can lead to emotional instability, jealousy, and rage. Their mind becomes a battlefield of suspicion and possessiveness. They misinterpret independence as betrayal, silence as rejection, and boundaries as disobedience. The more they tighten their grip, the more they lose control. Relationships built on dominance cannot sustain genuine love or trust, only fear. In time, the controller may find themselves alone, surrounded by the ruins of the relationships they tried to possess. From a psychological standpoint, obsession often stems from unresolved trauma or personality disorders. Many controllers struggle with deep feelings of inadequacy, abandonment, or fear of losing control. Their need to dominate others is a reflection of the chaos within themselves. Instead of confronting their inner pain, they externalize it, trying to control others to compensate for their lack of control over their own emotions. But obsession never brings peace. It only magnifies the emptiness. Socially, the consequences can be devastating. Once the truth of their behavior becomes visible, the controller may lose the respect and trust of those around them. Obsessive control often leads to the breakdown of families, friendships, and professional relationships. The manipulator's reputation becomes tainted by their own actions. Even if they try to justify their behavior as love, society increasingly recognizes control for what it is: abuse. In many cases, this can lead to legal consequences, such as restraining orders, loss of custody, or even imprisonment when control escalates into violence. Spiritually and morally, obsession corrodes the soul. It transforms compassion into coercion and affection into ownership. The controller loses their humanity by dehumanizing another person. What was once a relationship becomes a power struggle, a war between fear and freedom. And no one wins such a war. The price of obsession is also generational. Children who grow up witnessing obsessive control, whether in parents, caregivers, or authority figures, often internalize those dynamics. They may learn that love equals control or that obedience equals safety. Some grow into adults who repeat these patterns, either as victims or controllers themselves. Thus, the cycle of control continues, passing from one generation to the next unless it is consciously broken through education and emotional healing. Education and awareness are therefore not only tools of prevention, but also acts of liberation. When individuals learn to recognize the signs of obsessive control early, possessiveness disguised as care, jealousy masked as love, or guilt used as manipulation, they can set boundaries before the damage deepens. Teaching emotional literacy, empathy, and healthy communication in schools and communities can create a culture that values freedom over dominance, respect over power, and understanding over control. Ultimately, obsession is a self-defeating pursuit. It seeks to own what cannot be owned: the mind, the will, and the soul of another person. The more one tries to possess, the more one destroys. The more one clings, the more one loses. The victim loses peace and self-identity. The controller loses trust and humanity. In the end, the price of obsession is not paid in one moment. It is paid over time through the erosion of freedom, love, and dignity. It transforms relationships into prisons and people into prisoners, both those who control and those who are controlled. True healing can only begin when both sides recognize that love cannot exist where freedom is denied. Love thrives in choice, not in chains. And until that truth is understood, obsession will continue to take more than it ever gives, leaving behind silence, sorrow, and a desperate need for redemption. When control and obsession have already done their damage, there is only one true path forward: education and empowerment. Without knowledge, cycles of manipulation continue unchecked. Without empowerment, victims remain silent and abusers remain unchallenged. The key to ending this dangerous game of control lies not just in exposing it, but in teaching people how to recognize, resist, and rise above it. Education gives understanding. Empowerment gives courage. Together, they break the chain that binds generations to the same patterns of emotional captivity. Education begins with awareness, understanding what healthy relationships look like and how to identify when they begin to turn toxic. This may sound simple, but many people grow up with distorted ideas of love and loyalty. They learn that jealousy equals passion, that control means care, or that silence keeps peace. Schools rarely teach emotional literacy, yet it is as essential as reading or arithmetic. Emotional education should teach young people how to set boundaries, how to recognize manipulation, and how to express feelings without fear. When people are equipped with this knowledge early, they are far less likely to fall prey to the subtle traps of control later in life. One powerful aspect of education is deconstructing myths about love and power. Society has romanticized control for centuries, in movies, literature, even songs. The possessive lover is portrayed as devoted, the jealous partner as passionate, and the persistent pursuer as romantic. These narratives normalize unhealthy behavior and blur the line between love and obsession. By challenging these myths, educators and mentors can help individuals understand that real love is built on trust and respect, not fear and dependency. A person who truly loves you does not want to own your freedom. They want to see you grow in it. Empowerment, on the other hand, is about restoring voice and agency to those who have been silenced. For victims of control, empowerment begins with recognition, the moment they realize that what happened to them, it was not love but manipulation. This realization often brings a flood of emotions: anger, grief, guilt, and confusion. Empowerment means providing safe spaces for these emotions to be acknowledged and processed without judgment. Counseling, support groups, and educational programs can help survivors rebuild self-worth and confidence. They learn that they are not defined by what happened to them, but by how they choose to heal. Empowerment also involves teaching assertiveness, the ability to express one's needs, say no, and uphold boundaries without fear. For many who have lived under control, saying no feels dangerous or disrespectful. But in reality, boundaries are a sign of self-respect and mutual respect. Empowerment programs should emphasize that boundaries are not barriers. They are bridges that allow relationships to remain healthy and balanced. A critical part of breaking the cycle is community education. Obsession and control thrive in silence, and silence thrives in ignorance. Communities must learn to recognize the warning signs of manipulative or abusive behavior, not just in romantic relationships, but in families, workplaces, and friendships. Training programs for teachers, managers, and community leaders can help them identify when someone may be experiencing psychological control and how to respond appropriately. Too often, victims are told to just leave, without understanding that psychological manipulation creates invisible chains that are hard to break. Compassionate intervention requires education, patience, and understanding. Legal and institutional awareness also play a role. Laws against emotional and psychological abuse are still evolving in many societies. Education can drive change by encouraging policymakers to recognize coercive control as a legitimate form of abuse with real psychological consequences. When institutions, schools, workplaces, law enforcement understand the mechanisms of manipulation, they can provide better protection and support to those at risk. Empowerment, however, must also reach those who become the controllers. Obsessive and manipulative behaviors often stem from deep emotional wounds, insecurities, and learned patterns from childhood. While accountability is essential, rehabilitation should also be possible. Educational therapy programs can help individuals understand the roots of their behavior, why they need to control, what they fear, and how to replace dominance with empathy. Healing control at its source is as important as rescuing those who suffer from it. Stopping one controller prevents future victims. At a societal level, empowerment means changing the culture that excuses control. It means promoting empathy over ego, partnership over possession, Media, education, and leadership all have roles to play in shaping this cultural shift. When people see examples of healthy love, where independence is encouraged, where communication is open, and where equality is practiced, they begin to redefine what relationships should look like. One of the most transformative forms of empowerment is storytelling. When survivors speak, they reclaim power, not just for themselves, but for others who have yet to find their voice. Their stories expose the quiet cruelty of control and show others that healing is possible. Every testimony becomes an act of resistance, turning pain into purpose. This is why awareness campaigns, survivor education, and open dialogues are vital. They transform private suffering into public strength. Ultimately, education and empowerment are not abstract ideals. They are tools of liberation. Education opens the eyes, and empowerment strengthens the spirit. Together, they dismantle the systems, personal and societal, that allow control to persist. They remind both victims and observers that silence is the soil in which control grows. But truth is the light that makes it wither. Breaking the cycle begins with a simple understanding. Control is not love, and freedom is not rebellion. Each person deserves to be heard, respected, and free to live without fear. Through education, we learn to recognize manipulation. Through empowerment, we learn to rise above it. When awareness spreads, control loses its power. When victims find their voice, the chains begin to fall. And so, the journey from manipulation to justice, from silence to strength, ends not in revenge, but in freedom. The dangerous game of control can only be ended by those who refuse to play it, by those who choose to love, not to own, to teach, not to dominate, and to build a world where power no longer hides behind the mask of obsession.